Hello, Zero Books readers. In this video, we'll continue our discussion of the possibility of a debate between the Slovenian psychoanalyst and philosopher Slavoj Zizek and the psychologist and self-help YouTube star Jordan Peterson. Along the way, we'll consider a couple of excerpts from the Zero Books titles Heavy Radicals and Capitalist Superheroes. In the last video on this subject, I explored why it was that Žižek and Peterson are so often paired in what I'll call the internet imaginary. In this video, I'll take a look at how the promise of a future debate between Žižek and Peterson really came to be. On February 13, 2018, the online British newspaper The Independent ran a rather standard piece from Žižek entitled, "Why do people find Jordan Peterson so convincing?" People familiar with Žižek's work recognize the essay as Žižekian boilerplate. In fact, when I read the essay, I didn't bother to read the byline first, and about halfway in, I thought to myself, this person is stealing from Žižek. In any case, I was very familiar with Žižek's theoretical point about pathological jealousy, and pretty quickly realized that Žižek's target wasn't the once obscure and now wildly famous Canadian psychologist Jordan Peterson, but the crumbling liberal consensus that operates under the cloak of what Žižek calls political correctness. Peterson's fans on the alt-right and alt-light didn't read Žižek's essay the way I did. Neither did Peterson. In fact, it was the essay in The Independent that inspired Peterson to tweet angrily at what turned out to be a Žižek quote bot. If you wish to debate the validity of my apparently scientific theories, or any of my other claims, then let me know, and we'll arrange it.
I'm giving you a choice. Either put on these glasses, or start eating that trash can.
I already am eating from the trash can all the time.
After that, hundreds of YouTube videos were produced, pointing out that Žižek hadn't adequately refuted Peterson's various arguments. Of course, Žižek hadn't intended to refute Peterson's claims, let alone discredit the various facts he marshals as evidence in support of those claims. Instead, Žižek was making a point about how impoverished facts are on their own, and how even true facts can be used to justify a pathological, or, in layman's terms, a crazy interpretation of the world.
Not an argument!
That said, let's take a moment to look at one of the claims Žižek holds up as an example. Peterson apparently has said that the concept of white privilege is a Marxist lie. Trying to track that down, what I found was a YouTube video under the title, "White Privilege Isn't Real." In this video, Peterson refers to Peggy McIntosh's essay, "White Privilege and Male Privilege." Of course, McIntosh didn't coin the term, and her essay is not the best place to turn for a rigorous explanation of the concept.
Anyways, who cares about that? There's no such thing as methodology anyways. That's all part of the oppressive white male European patriarchy.
You might be better off turning to W.E.B. Du Bois. Du Bois was a 19th and 20th century sociologist from Harvard and a civil rights advocate.
There are some subjects that cannot even be discussed. The essence of the democratic process is free discussion. There was a time when men were not allowed to talk about universal suffrage, or the education of women, or freedom for Negro slaves. Today, communism is the dirty word, and socialism is suspect.
Du Bois wrote a book called Black Reconstruction in America, and in that book he discussed how what he described as a psychological wage of whiteness kept white and black working people from organizing in their own interest during the time of Reconstruction. Du Bois felt that racism against black people continued, and that a sense of white privilege, white labor's failure to integrate and fully develop working class participation in the project of what he called civilization, had led to world wars and economic depression. W.E.B. Du Bois was indeed a well-read Marxist. He thought of privilege in terms of economic conditions first. He also, according to Brainy quote, once wrote, "Make yourself do unpleasant things so as to gain the upper hand of your soul."
what I've recommended to people is clean up your room.
Žižek, of course, knows very well that the basis for white privilege isn't merely social privilege, but real material wealth. He also knows that overcoming this privilege is difficult and necessary, but not sufficient if we're going to arrive at a world that lives up to the Enlightenment values that Peterson sometimes claims to champion. Žižek is also deeply skeptical of any politics built on white guilt or perpetual victimhood. Žižek is also deeply skeptical of any politics built on white guilt or perpetual victimhood. When attacked for his 1998 essay, A Leftist's Plea for Eurocentrism, Žižek responded by quoting the Pan-Africanist, Marxist-humanist philosopher Frantz Fanon.
Fanon says, I am a man, and what I have to recapture is the whole past of the world. I am not responsible only for the slave revolt in Santo Domingo. Every time a man has contributed to the victory of the dignity of the spirit, every time a man has said no to an attempt to subjugate his fellows, I have felt solidarity with his act. In no way does my basic vocation has to be drawn from the past of peoples of color. In no way do I have to dedicate myself to reviving some black civilization unjustly ignored. I will not make myself the man of any past. My black skin is not a repository for specific values. Haven't I got better things to do on this earth than avenge the blacks of the 17th century? I, as a man of color, do not have the right to hope that in the white man there will be a crystallization of guilt towards the past of my race. I, as a man of color, do not have the right to seek ways of stamping down the pride of my former master. I have neither the right nor the duty to demand reparations for my subjugated ancestors. There is no black mission. There is no white burden. I do not want to be victim of the ruse of a black world. Am I going to ask today's white men to answer for the slave traders of the 17th century? Am I going to try by every means available to cause guilt to burgeon in their souls? I am not a slave to slavery that dehumanized my ancestors. It would be of enormous interest to discover a black literature or architecture from the 3rd century before Christ. We would be overjoyed to learn of the existence of a correspondence between some black philosopher and Plato. But we can absolutely not see how this fact would change the lives of 8-year-old kids working in the cane fields of Martinique or Guadeloupe. I find myself in the world and I recognize that I have one right alone, that of demanding human behavior from the other, and so on and so on. Sorry, but that's my position.
Žižek aims at a universal emancipation precisely because white privilege is a real material force in the world. Peterson, on the other hand, attacks those who would use bastardized versions of privilege theory as backdoor apologia for the status quo, even as he himself takes the stage as the biggest apologist for the world as it is.
A lot of what psychiatrists and psychologists do is maintain social order. I mean, that was a big part of criticism about psychiatric diagnosis in the 1960s. And, the people in the sort of radical left-wingers of the 60s thought that it was appalling that psychiatrists were involved in maintenance of social order. I don't happen to think it's appalling. I think it's necessary, but I think people should be honest about what they're doing.
Let's return briefly to the argument Žižek was making in his essay that used Peterson as an example for the left to learn from. What did Žižek mean when he wrote that even if what a jealous husband claims about his wife, that she sleeps around with other men, is all true, his jealousy is still pathological? A real-world example of this can be found in the FBI's reaction to the threat of communism in the 1960s, and simultaneously to the communist left's reaction to the real infiltration of their organizations by the FBI. Reading Heavy Radicals by Aaron Leonard and Conor Gallagher, one quickly discovers that the House of Un-American Activities Committee was absolutely right to fear communist infiltration into the civil rights and union movements in the United States. Maoists were doing their level best to infiltrate every point of protest and lead the working class to a violent confrontation with the U.S. government. But what UAC's paranoia misses is why these communists were so useful to their own project, and conversely, when Aaron Leonard began the project of re-examining Maoist movements in the 60s, he found out that it was mostly the FBI's attempts to infiltrate and corrupt Maoist organizations that gave his own project any life. Quote, "A number of people question whether there was any value in giving attention to a U.S. Maoist organization whose best days were decades in the past. Well, if it were just a matter of assessing Maoism in the United States in that period, this would be a lesser book, relevant with its own specific lessons, but still a much drier story. However, it was the interaction of the group with the secret police of the United States, which itself was highly political, that ultimately animated this undertaking. To get an even clearer understanding of how the jealous husband pathology works, we might consider the police expulsion of Occupy Wall Street in 2011. Imagine if the police hadn't interfered. Wouldn't the outcome of Occupy have been even worse? That is, without the excuse of police oppression, how would Occupy organizers have justified their own lack of direction? How would they have dealt with the party-like atmosphere, the lawlessness, even the sexual assaults that occurred in Zuccotti Park?
Mostly drunk guys going and groping girls. There was a guy that got raped too here, a deaf younger man.
In a sense, the police suppression was a blessing, because it filled in the gaps and failures in the left's own movement. Surely the same is true for Maoist organizations in the 60s and 70s. Zizek's main complaint against Peterson is that he invents the figure of the neo-Marxist as a way to justify the failures and gaps in the very civilization that Peterson wants to protect. He does this in precisely the same way that the Maoist turned to the figure of the G-Man to explain away his own failure. It's significant that Peterson is a Jungian, that his main way to understand reality is through myths, because myths, even when they are partially true, are the way we paper over real contradictions and gaps in our social life. In his book, Capitalist Superheroes, Dan Hassler-Forrest wrote that the difficulty under capitalism is to find a stable mythology expressive of its inherent values and meaning. He went on to argue that the superhero figure in Hollywood movies is one of the many stable mythologies that we hope can express fundamental beliefs about capitalism while temporarily overcoming the anxieties and problems that capitalism produces.
Exploded.
Attacking or celebrating Jordan Peterson with his maps of meaning, with his partial truths and historical misreadings, is another way that we might all gloss over or try to fill in the gap with another stable mythology.
Faster than a speeding bullet, more powerful than a locomotive, able to leap tall buildings at a single bound. The infant of Krypton is now the man of steel, Superman. To best be in a position to use his amazing powers in a never-ending battle for true justice, Superman has assumed the skies of Clark Kent, mild-mannered reporter for a great metropolitan newspaper.
Thanks for watching this Zero Books video and helping us push our commie propaganda. You might have noticed that Capitalist Superheroes and Heavy Radicals are the books we featured in the video, and I want to urge you to go ahead and go get them either online, at your local bookstore, or at your local library. They are well worth reading. Also, subscribe to this channel for more videos like this one, and if you're not already a patron of our Insider podcast called Inside Zero Books, you should be.